Hi everyone, and thank you for being here today. Also, a special thank you to the culture organizers, Henby family, and to my fellow presenters. My name is Rebecca Friedel-Juan, and today I will present some of my dissertation research, which reconstructed a socioecological history of human-plant relationships in the Mopan River Valley of modern-day Belize. You can see the study region here on this map, and I focused on the major periods of ancient Maya occupation. I'll focus solely here on the major conclusions arrived at by my research, but if anyone is interested in the details, my dissertation is free to access via ProQuest, or you can email me for it. As an overview, I'll start by reviewing some of the major ideas surrounding ancient Maya transformations and how they've been conceptualized by scholars and the broader public. I'll then present how I have conceptualized these same transformations through the framing of resilience thinking, which aims to understand what causes some systems to quote-unquote collapse and others to remain resilient in the face of major changes, such as droughts, famine, or other major socio-ecological upheavals. I'll then discuss how I use this framework of resilience thinking to make sense of a history of human-plant relationships. In particular, I will situate these ideas within a broader sociopolitical history of my study region, the Mopan River Valley of modern-day Western Belize. I'll then conclude with a brief overview of my major conclusions. In general, the history of ancient Maya society in this region has been conceptualized using these four major concepts, highlighting the changing or transformative nature of the culture through time. First, ancient Maya society during the pre-classic period has been theorized through the lens of a rise in complexity. This is when most of the population occupying the Maya region began to settle on the landscape. They started manipulating the forests through agricultural production and constructing larger and larger buildings for public gatherings and rituals and ultimately elite use. Following this diverse and dynamic period of settling on the landscape through various cultural practices in the region, the ancient Maya are well known for their classic period florescence, where there was a focus on accumulating wealth at specific political centers across the Maya region. This is when we see the widespread use of hieroglyphic writing and elaboration in art and architecture, and the solidification of an elite and commoner divide in social classes. There's also clear evidence for warfare and alliance building with outside and internal polities, with victories and losses being commemorated on stela that have been erected at major sites throughout the area. This continued accumulation of wealth and power at political centers did not last forever for all of them, however, as we see an eventual decline and ultimate abandonment of many of the major centers, particularly in the central lowlands during the terminal classic period. This, as I'm sure many of you have heard, has come to be called the ancient Maya collapse, which often gets misinterpreted as a sweeping notion that the people who once inhabited all of this area disappeared and left the region barren. This misinterpretation is just that, misinformed and misleading. Instead, we understand that ancient societies, the Maya included, constantly changed and shifted in their social, political, and ecological relationships, with some political centers falling into disuse by the end of the terminal classic, but others continued to flourish up until the arrival of Europeans. For the latter, you can tune in on Friday to hear various presentations about the resilience and longevity of Lamanai, also right here in Belize. This period following the disintegration of several previously dominant political centers in the region has been conceptualized as a reorganization in both general population movement as well as power shifts to different political centers, mostly as a shift to the northern Yucatan region. But as I mentioned, there are several sites, including Lamanai, in the southern lowlands that continue to prosper. These four major transformations of broader Maya society are what have informed my investigations of a history of human-plant relationships in the Mopan River Valley of Belize, and how such relationships may have played a role in these sociopolitical dynamics as they played out in this specific area. Specifically for my research, I wanted to know what was different about each of these time periods in regards to the ways people interacted with and managed plants on the landscape that may have played a role in how these sociopolitical dynamics played out. To investigate, I conceptualized the Mopan River Valley as a socioecological system, which understands that humans are only one part of a broader system that also includes non-human entities such as plants. Essentially, in systems, we understand that humans will impact the plants, while the plants will also then impact the humans in what we call continuous feedback loops. Diversity is a term you've probably heard repeatedly in various contexts and made most popular in relation to biodiversity in studies of biology and ecology. There are many ways to measure diversity within any given context, but generally most scholars agree that any measure of higher diversity is a good thing. Similarly, within systems thinking, there is a central notion that diversity is important for maintaining a resilient system so that it can continue to function through any major shock to the system, like drought, famine, or other socioecological disaster. Essentially, the more taxa of plants present on the landscape, the more likely that there will be any species with a function or response able to adapt to any given change, and then maintain the overall functioning of the system to prevent a collapse or what we call a release. Following these ideas, I suggested that the ways humans interact with plants could play a major role in whether the broader system maintained resilience. So if the populations of the Mopan River Valley interacted with plants in such a way to diminish their overall diversity through time, this could have introduced major vulnerabilities to the system, causing it not to be able to adapt to major changes, namely a series of droughts which we know occurred in the Maya region at the end of the late Classic and into the terminal Classic periods. So now that I've laid out my theoretical approach to investigating the ancient Maya, I'll give a brief history of the specific region I studied to contextualize things before I present my ultimate results. Based on over a century of work in the area, I was able to construct a complex adaptive cycle model for the ancient Mopan River Valley socioecological system to be able to test my hypothesis regarding the role of plant diversity in its resilience dynamics and potential vulnerabilities. This is a lot of data, so I apologize for the text-heavy slide. As I mentioned, it's over a century worth of work, but bear with me. Generally, the initial occupation phase for the Mopan River Valley correlates with the late Archaic up to the beginning of the Middle Preclassic period. This was when human populations were first entering the area and experimenting with its various resources. During this phase, research has documented various ecozones being utilized and eventually settled, from low-lying river valleys to hilltop bluffs. As data for this general period is limited in the Mopan River Valley, some evidence for this part of the model comes from the broader Belize River Valley and the transition between the exploitation and conservation phases. Notably, from the site of Chan, just at the periphery of the Mopan River Valley, agricultural terracing and water management systems have been documented by Dr. Andrew Wyatt as being established as early as the Middle Preclassic. Furthermore, a Middle Preclassic chaltun at Calpech was investigated by Dr. Terry Powis and colleagues, revealing resources obtained from a diversity of habitats and through a diversity of strategies, including a variety of domesticated and wild plants, as well as both local and imported terrestrial, avian, and marine fauna. These all suggest a diversity of resource acquisition strategies were being utilized during this early period. Transitioning into the conservation phase, which likely began also during the Middle Preclassic, is when we see the first major architectural investment in monumental centers of the Mopan River Valley at the site of early Shinantanich. These centers of accumulating wealth shift to various locales throughout the valley, including Octun Khan during the terminal Preclassic, then Buena Vista del Cayo during the early Classic, and finally Shinantanich during the late Classic. Notably, investigations into the region's precipitation dynamics show that droughts occurred during Octun Khan's prowess in the terminal Preclassic, but no broader system collapse occurs. Instead, we see that population size continues to grow and wealth continues to accumulate at these polycenters in the sequence as I just described. Other data for this period regarding human-environment interactions largely comes from the end of it, during the end of the late Classic. Specifically, research by Neff and colleagues suggests that the landscape was dominated by agricultural terracing and a substantial hinterland population by the end of the late Classic. Their research documented an average of 138 agricultural terraces per square kilometer, supporting a population that peaked at 524 people per square kilometer. Isotopic work on late Classic fauna by Dr. Carolyn Frywald and colleagues shows that the majority of wild game was being obtained from habitats outside of the Mopan River Valley. So of these few that were obtained locally, though, isotopic signatures showed that their diets were majority C4 plants. This just means herbaceous taxa, probably largely maize. So this suggests that the landscape was probably deforested and these deer were eating herbaceous plants instead of more leafy foliage. Also of relevance here is the study by David Lentz and colleagues investigating macrobotanical remains from various sites throughout the region, ultimately concluding that late classic elites likely situated at Shingantanich had restricted the broader population's access to imported pine wood, making it a commodity by the end of the late classic. Climate research, as I mentioned, shows that under the period of sociopolitical fluorescence at these various sites, the region saw multiple droughts. These terminal classic droughts, unlike the ones during the terminal pre-classic, correspond with a release phase or sociopolitical collapse during this time. This has been documented with population declines at some sites as high as 60%. We also see the failure of elites at Shingantanich to control any substantial labor for continuous accumulation of wealth at the site, with no major architectural projects being completed. The following reorganization period during the post-classic shows a substantial reduction in population, with estimates revealing occupation frequencies of 0%. While this is a noteworthy reduction, more recent investigations have identified some post-classic ceramics at the residential structures within the region, as well as some abandoned political centers, likely indicating veneration of the past sociopolitical landscapes, as well as much smaller yet continued occupation in the valley. The reorganization phase for the region is generally poorly understood, but it has been accepted that some smaller populations remained with a very different political organization, likely focused on more local networks. Knowing this general sociopolitical history, which, as I mentioned, was informed by over a century of research in the area, has allowed me to ask some questions about the past that traditionally may not have been asked without such immense background data. Namely, how did people on the past utilize and manage plants on the landscape, and how did these practices relate to broader sociopolitical and climatic trends, if at all? To answer these questions, I took an interdisciplinary approach by combining methods and theories from a broad number of disciplines like paleoecology, botany, archaeology, geology, palynology, and anthropology. This entailed collecting cores of sediments from the bottom of a small body of water in the village of Kala Creek that I then conducted various analyses on, including the isolation and identification of pollen spores in various layers of the cores to understand what kinds of plant taxa were present on the landscape through time. I was then able to ask questions about the nature of these data in relation to the already known sociopolitical and climatic dynamics that I just described. Through these data, I was able to show that a steady decrease in plant diversity on the landscape over time led to the lowest diversity seen by the terminal classic period. This ultimately supported the hypothesis that low plant diversity was an indicator of vulnerabilities in the system that may have aided in the sociopolitical collapse that we know occurred in the valley. Such vulnerabilities caused by low plant diversity on the landscape when combined with long periods of intense drought could be low land albedo or high solar heat retention in the landscape, poor soil permeability, and ultimately poor crop harvests. Based on these data, plus several other supplementary data sets, I investigated what may have caused this low plant diversity and what kinds of plants were actually being favored on the landscape. This last hypothesis I tested through various means. First, I looked at the types of plant taxa indicated by the pollen, which could give me an idea if the landscape was largely forested or dominated by herbaceous species through time. Secondly, I reconstructed the amount of biomass burned on the landscape through time through quantifying the amount of charcoal present in the same sediment cores that the pollen was extracted. This helped me to understand the potential amount of slash and burn agriculture and general wood burning that was being done locally, which equates to levels of deforestation. Lastly, I investigated the types of plants utilized within a hinterland community center through time to see if the plants that local community members favored shifted through time as well, and what taxa may indicate about the local system. Ultimately, this continuous reduction in diversity of plants on the landscape correlates with a steady increase in biomass burning on the landscape until the middle of the late Classic, when it decreases dramatically. This could indicate one of two things: that the local inhabitants suddenly shifted their landscape management style, or that the trend of high biomass burning through time had deforested the landscape, leaving it with less biomass to burn due to the lack of time for regeneration between harvest cycles. Based on the types of plants identified in the pollen, it was likely the latter, due to a lack of forest habitat species and an overdominance of herbaceous or deforested habitat species. As you can see on the figure pictured, the diversity of macrobotanical remains, or plants utilized within the community center, actually increased during the terminal classic. When looking at what kinds of plants these were, we actually see that pinewood is the dominant, if not only, species being utilized here up until the terminal classic, when it is completely absent and instead is replaced by a diversity of more local and disturbance indicating taxa like palmwood. These data support the previously discussed hypothesis by Dr. David Lentz and colleagues that the local elites situated at Chinantanich had previously controlled the importation of pine timber by the late Classic period. It's likely that the imported pine wood held some ideological significance given its longevity of use at the community center, which the elites may have taken advantage of by controlling the distribution of, perhaps for profit. This importance given to imported timber products may have caused for the local communities to overlook the value of local timber products through time. Ultimately, with the collapse of Chinantanich's sociopolitical power, we see the local communities resorting to historically less desired but locally available alternatives. These are only some of the major conclusions arrived at by my research, and I could go on for quite a bit longer, but in the interest of time, I will end there. So I have an abundance of people and entities to thank, only some of which are shown here, including the funding agencies that made this research possible, like NSF, LACOR, and UTSA, as well as the research support from these entities plus that of ICOSOR. And of course, I need to thank my many collaborators at MVAP and MVPP, as well as the HENBI and Fahina families for all of their support throughout the years. Finally, I want to thank you all again for watching my presentation, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.